The war had ended, but the galaxy was not at peace. After years of fighting, the factions were tired, and many people had lost their lives. The stars that once shimmered brightly were now dimmed by the destruction. The human race had fought hard, and they had won, but the cost was high. Jackson, a soldier, was one of the few who survived the final battle. He had seen things no one should ever have to see. Yet his role in the war was not over. Jackson stood alone in a quiet room, his eyes staring out of the large window. Beyond the glass, the stars seemed distant, cold, and endless. He had been part of something bigger, something that had changed. The fate of the galaxy. Yet now that the fighting was over, he felt empty. He had lost friends, comrades, and parts of himself he would never get back. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and a voice called out to him. "Jackson, it's time," said General Harris, a man who had once been Jackson's commanding officer. His voice was serious, but there was a sense of urgency in it that made Jackson snap to attention. He nodded and followed Harris through the halls. Of the command center as they walked, Jackson tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The war had ended, but why did he still feel like something was about to happen? The general didn't say much, but there was a strange tension. In the air, they arrived at a large conference room, where several officers were already gathered around a table. At the far end of the room stood President Lawson, the leader of the human government. He was a tall, stern man with a hard look in his eyes. Jackson could tell something serious was going on. "Jackson, please have a seat," President Lawson said, gesturing toward an empty chair at the table. As Jackson sat down, Lawson's eyes remained fixed on him. "Jackson," Lawson began, "I know this is going to sound strange, but you've been chosen for something important." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Chosen? What do you mean?" "We've just learned that you've inherited something. Something that we believe could change the course of history," Lawson said, his voice heavy with meaning. "You've been named the heir to the Thalorian Empire." The words hit Jackson like a wave crashing on the shore. The Thalorian Empire was an ancient and powerful alien race that had been wiped out during the war. Their empire had fallen in the final battle. And now, somehow, he had inherited it? "I don't understand," Jackson replied, his voice uncertain. "How can I be their heir? I'm just a soldier. I don't even know their language, their culture, or how their empire worked." President Lawson sighed, looking around at the officers. "You don't know this, but during the war, there was a secret pact between the Thalorians and us. The princess of the Thalorian Empire, Princess Lyra, made a deal with us. She promised that if humanity saved her, her empire would be protected, and in exchange, she would give her life to ensure the galaxy was safe from the Zephyrians." Jackson's mind was racing. He had heard rumors of Princess Lyra, but had never known the details. The Thalorian Empire had always been a mysterious force in the galaxy, and their princess was considered both powerful and unreachable. "But I didn't." "Do anything special?" Jackson said. "I didn't save her. I just fought in the war." "It's more complicated than that," General Harris spoke up. "You see, during the final battle, Princess Lyra's family line was destroyed. Her people were wiped out, and now she is the last of her kind. But because of the pact she made with humanity, she has left everything to you." "Me?" Jackson asked. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know anything about ruling an empire." "You don't have to rule it," President Lawson said. "But you are now the leader of what's left of the Thalorian Empire. The remnants of her people are looking to you, Jackson. They've already accepted you as their new leader. It's not a position you've sought, but it's one you've inherited." Jackson's head was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could a soldier like him, someone who had only fought to survive, become the ruler of an entire alien empire? It felt surreal. But there was one thing he knew for sure. This was real. "We'll guide you," General Harris continued. "We'll help you understand what you need to do. But for now, your priority is to meet Princess Lyra. She's been waiting for you." "Princess Lyra?" Jackson repeated, still in shock. "Yes," President Lawson confirmed. "She's in a holding facility. You'll meet her soon. She's the last member of the royal family. You need to make contact with her and learn what she expects of you." Jackson didn't know what to think. His life had been turned upside down in an instant. From a simple soldier to the leader of an alien empire, how was he supposed to deal with that? But he knew there was no turning back now. He had to meet Princess Lyra, and he had to figure out what it meant to inherit an empire. Jackson walked through the halls of the facility, his mind still reeling from the conversation he had just had. He didn't feel ready. But who could be ready for something like this? He was led to a large high-security room. Inside, Princess Lyra was waiting. She was sitting on a chair, her posture regal but sad. Her long dark hair flowed down her back, and her alien features were beautiful but distant. Eyes met Jackson's, and for a moment there was a silence. "Are you the one?" she asked, her voice soft and full of emotion. Jackson nodded slowly. "I'm Jackson, the soldier who inherited your empire." Lyra stood up, her expression hard to read. "Then you are my last hope," she said, her voice. After Jackson's unexpected inheritance of the Thalorian Empire, he was led into a high-security room to meet Princess Lyra. The situation was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The weight of the title he now held felt too heavy on his shoulders. He was just a soldier, not a ruler. How was he supposed to lead an entire alien race? And what did Lyra, the last member of the Thalorian royal family, expect from him? Princess Lyra stood tall, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a deep sorrow that had not been washed away by the passing of the war. The once proud and mighty Thalorian Empire had crumbled, and she had lost everything. Her people were gone, her family was gone, now she was left with nothing but a broken empire and an unfamiliar human soldier standing before her. "Are you the one who inherited everything?" Lyra asked, her voice calm but tinged with an unmistakable bitterness. Jackson didn't know how to respond. He had been thrust into this position without warning. He had fought in the war, but that was nothing compared to the responsibility he received. Now Hattie nodded slowly, trying to find the right words. "I'm Jackson," he said, his voice steady but unsure. "I never asked for this. I'm just a soldier. But the General and President Lawson, they say I'm now the leader of your people." Lyra studied him closely. Her eyes were dark, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at him with admiration or respect. Instead, there was a coldness that Jackson couldn't ignore. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Your people fought hard for the galaxy," she said, her voice softening. "But that doesn't mean you can simply walk into a role you don't understand. You might have inherited the title, Jackson, but that doesn't make you ready to lead." Jackson winced at her words. He knew she was right. He didn't understand anything about ruling an empire, especially one as ancient and complex as the Thalorian Empire. He was just a soldier, someone who followed orders and fought for survival. How was he supposed to lead? "I know I'm not ready," Jackson admitted, lowering his gaze. "But I'll do my best. I promise I'll try to learn, even if it takes time." Lyra was silent for a moment, her gaze softening slightly. She looked down at the floor, then back at Jackson. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "The Thalorian Empire wasn't just a collection of planets or armies. It was a way of life. It was about honor, tradition, and power. We ruled the stars with wisdom and strength, but now all of that is gone." She paused, her voice filled with sorrow. "My people are scattered. My family is dead. Oh, now I have to rely on a human soldier to lead what's left of us." Jackson felt the weight of her words. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to lose everything, the whole galaxy watching as your empire falls apart. Lyra had been the future of her people, their hope for a new era. And now she was alone. The thought of being in her shoes made Jackson realize how important his role really was. He couldn't let her down. "I may not understand your empire," Jackson said, his voice growing stronger, "but I understand loss. Lost friends, comrades, and pieces of myself in this war. I may not know how to lead, but I do know that I'll stand by you. I'll do whatever it takes to help rebuild what's been lost." Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was hesitation in her expression, but for the first time, Jackson saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Maybe she didn't believe him completely, but for a moment, she considered his words. "I've heard many promises, Jackson," she said quietly, "but words don't mean much in the galaxy we live in. Only actions speak." Jackson nodded, Then I'll show you. I'll prove it through my actions. There was another long pause before Lyra spoke again. You need to understand that your role is not just about leading a handful of survivors. The Thalorian people have scattered to the corners of the galaxy. Some will welcome you, but others will see you as a human who stole everything. From them, Jackson's heart sank at the thought. He had never been prepared for this kind of responsibility. He had always been a soldier, someone who followed orders. But now, the fate of an entire alien race rested in his hands. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but there was no turning back. I don't know how to unite your people, Jackson admitted, his voice soft. But I do know that we have to start somewhere. Maybe we can begin by bringing them together, showing them that humanity isn't their enemy. Lyra's eyes softened a little. She looked at him with something close to respect, though it was hard to say for sure. Perhaps, she said, her voice thoughtful, but it won't be easy. Some of my people believe that our empire fell because of weakness. They won't easily trust a human to lead them, even if you are now their heir. Jackson nodded. I'm not asking for their trust right away. I just want a chance to prove myself. Lyra stood up, walking slowly toward the window. She looked out at the stars, the vastness of space reflecting in her eyes. We will have to move carefully, she said, her voice distant. The Thalorian Empire was built on power, and many of my people are still loyal to the old ways. They won't accept a human as their ruler without a fight. We may be able to rebuild, but we have to be prepared for what comes next. Jackson followed her gaze out the window. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But he also knew that if he wanted to honor the promise he had made to Lyra, he would have to fight just like he had fought in the war. Only this time, the battle wasn't for survival, but for hope. We'll face it together, Jackson said quietly, and I'll stand by you. Lyra turned to him, her eyes searching his face once again. For the first time, she nodded slightly. It wasn't a sign of full trust, but it was a step forward. And for Jackson, that was Jackson had never imagined that one day he would be responsible for the future of an entire alien race. But as the days passed, he found himself stepping into a role he had never asked for and at times didn't feel ready for. The weight of the Thalorian Empire's history rested on his shoulders, and Princess Lyra, the last of her royal line, was watching him closely. Lyra was still hesitant to trust him fully. She had spent most of her life among her own people, learning their ways, their culture, their history. To her, Jackson was an outsider, a human soldier thrown into a position of power that he didn't understand. But despite her doubts, Lyra had agreed to help Jackson, and together they began the difficult task of learning to lead the remnants of her people. First, we need to establish trust, Lyra told Jackson one evening as they sat in a quiet room. Within the facility, without trust, we won't be able to unite the Thalorians. They've seen too much destruction, and they won't follow anyone who isn't worthy of their loyalty. Jackson nodded. I understand, but how do we earn their trust? Lyra looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. By showing them that we're not just here to control them. We're here to rebuild with them, not for them. The Thalorian people were always proud, but they respected strength and wisdom. You may not know their ways, but you know how to survive. And that's a start. Jackson sat back, thinking about her words. He had always been a fighter, a soldier who followed orders. But leading an empire was different. He had to think beyond battles and strategies. He had to think about people, their hopes, their fears, and their desires. All right, Jackson said, determination in his voice. So where do we start? Lyra stood up and walked to a large map of the galaxy that was spread out on the table. We start by reaching out to the scattered Thalorian factions. Some may still resist us, but others may be willing to listen. We'll need to approach them carefully, but with confidence. If they see us as weak, they won't follow. Jackson stood up and moved closer to the map. How do we know who's with us and who's against us? Oh, we don't, Lyra replied, with a small, sad smile. That's part of the challenge, but we can't be afraid of what we don't know. We'll need to make alliances, even with those we're not sure about, and we'll need to show them that humanity is an ally, not an enemy. For the next few weeks, Jackson and Lyra worked together, forming a plan to reconnect with the Thalorian factions. They communicated with various outposts and colonies, sending envoys and messages, hoping to rebuild the broken ties between the Thalorians and the humans. But not everyone was eager to listen. One day they received a message from a distant Thalorian colony that had not yet fallen during the war. The message was clear. They would not recognize Jackson as their leader. They demanded that Lyra return to them and lead them as the princess of the Thalorian Empire. "We need to handle this carefully," Lyra said, her face tense as she read the message aloud. "This is one of the last factions loyal to the old Empire. They still see me as their ruler, and they won't take kindly to a human leading them." Jackson leaned forward, his eyes focused. "So what do? We meet them," Lyra said firmly. "We can't avoid them forever. But we have to make sure they understand that I'm not going to rule alone. We're in this together." Next day, Jackson and Lyra boarded a small ship and set out toward the Thalorian colony. The journey was long and tense, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. Lyra had been quiet since the message came, and Jackson could tell that this meeting was weighing heavily on her. She was the princess, the last hope of her people. But she had never wanted to rule alone. She needed Jackson's help, even if she didn't always show it. When they arrived at the colony, they were greeted by a small group of Thalorian warriors. Their eyes were cold, and their posture was stiff with distrust. The leader, a tall and broad-shouldered Thalorian, stepped forward. "I am Commander Corrin," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "We have received your message, Princess Lyra, but we do not recognize a human as the ruler of our empire." Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "I understand your loyalty to the old ways, Commander Corrin, but the war is over. The Thalorian Empire is no more. What remains of it must rebuild, and we cannot do that by clinging to the past." Commander Corrin's eyes narrowed. "And you expect us to follow a human soldier? Your people are the reason our empire fell." Jackson stepped forward, his presence strong but calm. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said. "I'm here because I believe the future of the Thalorian people is worth fighting for. You may not trust me now, but you don't have to. Trust Lyra. Trust that we can rebuild together." There was a long silence. Corrin looked from Jackson to Lyra, weighing his options. The tension in the air was thick, but Jackson stood his ground. He didn't expect Corrin to agree immediately, but he knew this was the first step. Finally, Commander Corrin spoke. "Have much to prove, human. But I will give you a chance. We'll meet again, and we will see if you are worthy of leading us." Lyra's face softened, and she turned to Jackson. "We have to be patient, but this is a start. We may not have their loyalty yet, but we're beginning to earn their respect." As they left the colony, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The road ahead would be difficult, and the challenges they faced were far from over. But for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. He and Lyra were beginning to work together, to understand each other, and to build a future where the Thalorian people could stand strong once again. And Jackson, for all his doubts and fears, knew that no matter what happened next, he would do whatever it took to help rebuild this broken empire and make some progress. But the road ahead was far from easy. The remnants of the Thalorian people were scattered across the galaxy, each faction holding on to their own ideals of what the Empire had been. Many were hesitant to accept a human as their leader, and the weight of their distrust was a constant challenge for Jackson. But one thing had become clear. Jackson and Lyra had to be united. Not just for the sake of the Thalorian Empire, but for the future of the galaxy itself. The war might have ended, but the consequences were still being felt across the stars. And in the shadows, a new threat was beginning to stir. Jackson and Lyra sat in the war room, their eyes fixed on the map of the galaxy displayed before them. The table was covered with reports and messages from the various Thalorian factions. Some were open to negotiations, others were still resistant. The political landscape was as unstable as ever, but for the moment, Jackson felt hopeful. They had made progress, and he believed they could make more. "We've made contact with several factions," Lyra said, pointing to the map. But there are still pockets of resistance. Some of them believe the old empire will rise again. They want to return to the past, but that's impossible. We can never go back. Jackson nodded. You have to convince them that the future is worth fighting for. If we don't, we'll be stuck in the past forever. Lyra turned to him, her eyes serious. That's easier said than done. The Thalorians were proud, but they were also stubborn. They may not accept change easily. And there are still those who see me as weak, especially with a human by my side. Jackson understood the challenge. The Thalorian Empire had been built on strength, and for centuries it had ruled the galaxy. Change was not something many of their people welcomed, but they had no choice. The old ways had failed, and the only path forward was one of cooperation and unity. Just as Jackson opened his mouth to speak, the door to the war room slid open, and General Harris entered, his face grim. "Sir, we've received troubling news," Harris said, his voice low. "There's been an attack on one of our colonies in the Vither system, the Zephyrians." The mention of the Zephyrians sent a chill down Jackson's spine. The Zephyrians were a ruthless alien race, known for their cruelty and their thirst for power. They had been a threat during the war, but their defeat had seemed like a victory for humanity. Apparently that victory had been short-lived. "What are they doing in the Vither system?" Lyra asked, her voice tight with concern. "They've launched a surprise assault," Harris explained. "Our colonies in that system are under heavy attack. It seems like they're targeting strategic outposts and resources. But there's something else." Jackson looked at him, his mind racing. "What else?" Harris hesitated for a moment before answering. "We've intercepted a transmission. The Zephyrians are making a claim. They're saying that the humans and Thalorians have formed an alliance and that they're preparing for an invasion. They want to prevent it before it starts." Lyra frowned. "They want to prevent what?" "They've already lost the war. What could they possibly hope to achieve now?" "They're trying to create fear," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "If they can convince the galaxy that we're a united threat, they'll have an excuse to attack first." Lyra stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. "They've always been cowards, hiding behind lies and propaganda. But we won't let them win this time. We have to stop them." Jackson nodded. "I agree, but we need to act fast. If we wait too long, they'll have all the time they need to build their case and gain support from other factions." "Can't allow them to divide us again," Lyra said, her voice steady with resolve. "We need to send a message. Strong. 1. Jackson's thoughts raced. The Zephyrians were a dangerous enemy, but their strength was in their ability to manipulate fear. They had no real claim to the galaxy anymore, but they could still rally others to their cause if they painted. The humans and Thalorians as a joint threat, it would be a tough battle. And Jackson knew that the stakes were higher than ever. "We'll need a fleet," Jackson said, his mind working through the options. "We can't fight them with just words. We need to show them that we're ready to defend ourselves, and we need to do it quickly." "We don't have a full fleet anymore," General Harris pointed out. "The war left us weakened, and rebuilding takes time." "But we have resources," Jackson replied, "and we have allies. The Thalorians may not trust us completely, but they'll fight if we give them a reason to. We just need to prove that we're worth following." Lyra looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "And what about the other factions? Some of them are still unsure about our alliance." "I'll come around," Jackson said, his voice confident. "They may not like the idea of working with humans, but they'll see that our survival depends on it. If the Zephyrians can unite them against us, we'll never stand a chance." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. We can't afford to be divided. We'll have to convince the others to join us. I'll send out a message to the remaining Thalorian leaders. We need to prepare for war." The room fell silent as Jackson and Lyra stood together, facing the difficult task ahead. The Zephyrians had made their move, and now it was up to them to respond. Jackson had always been a soldier, but now he was leading something far greater than just a battle. He was leading the future of the galaxy. Jackson turned to General Harris. "Prepare our forces. We'll need to act quickly." "Yes, sir," Harris replied, his face hardening with determination. As Harris left to carry out the orders, Lyra turned to Jackson. "This is only the beginning, isn't it?" Jackson looked at her, his expression serious. "Yes, but we've fought worse enemies before, and we'll fight this one together." The challenge ahead was daunting, but Jackson had no intention of backing down. He had made a promise to Lyra and to the Thalorian people that he would help rebuild their empire. Now, with the Zephyrians threatening everything they had worked for, it was time to prove that humanity could rise to. The Zephyrian threat had forced Jackson and Lyra into action. The galaxy was on edge, and every faction in the galaxy was watching to see what would happen next. The tension between the humans and Thalorians was still fresh, and now the Zephyrians were attempting to use that tension to tear apart the fragile alliances they had started to form. Jackson paced in the war room, his mind filled with thoughts about the coming conflict. The Zephyrians were an unpredictable force. Their attempt to manipulate the galaxy's fear of a united human-Thalorian alliance would be dangerous for both sides. Jackson had seen the way the Zephyrians worked, always using lies and fear as weapons to control others. Now, it seemed they were ready to use that fear against the galaxy once more. Lyra, who had been unusually quiet for the last few days, sat at the table, her eyes scanning the map in front of her. The war room was filled with messages from their allies and reports from the Thalorian colonies. They had yet to hear back from some of the more distant factions. But Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to choose sides. Jackson, Lyra said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a tension in the air. "I've been thinking." Jackson stopped pacing and turned to face her. He could tell that something was weighing heavily on her. "What's on your mind?" Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I never wanted to rule," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I never wanted to be a leader. I wanted to be free. But now everything is different. I've been thrust into this position, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry the weight of it." Jackson walked over and sat beside her, placing a hand on the table. He understood her feelings. He had never asked for the role he was in either. The idea of leading an empire was overwhelming for both of them. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Lyra, Jackson said gently. "I never imagined that I would be in this position either. But you're not alone in this. I'm here. We're in this together. You don't have to do this by yourself." Lyra turned her gaze to him, her eyes filled with doubt. "But I'm the one who has to make the final decision. I'm the one who has to guide my people, to help them rebuild. If I fail, if I make the wrong choice, everything could fall apart. I can't let that happen." Jackson could see the fear in her eyes, the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. She was still the princess, but now she was also the last hope of her people. It was a burden that no one could truly prepare for, no matter how strong they were. "You don't have to carry all of it by yourself," Jackson said again, his voice firm. "You have people who care about you, people who want to help. We'll make the decisions together. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Lyra was silent for a moment, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. She was strong, but this was a responsibility that no one should have to shoulder alone. And yet, she had been forced into this role because of the war, because of the collapse of the Thalorian Empire. Her people were looking to her for guidance, and the weight of their expectations was almost too much for her to bear. She began, her voice faltering. "I don't know if I'm ready. How can I lead when I don't even know where to start? The Thalorian Empire is gone. We're all that's left." Jackson reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. "Not alone, Lyra. You've got me. You've got the people who are still loyal to you. You've got the Thalorian colonies who want to see this empire rise again. You have a chance to rebuild it, to make it something better. You don't have to do it the way it was before. You can change things." Lyra's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to relax. It was clear that she was still struggling, but Jackson's words gave her a small sense of hope. Maybe she didn't have to follow the old path of the Thalorian Empire. Maybe she could create something new, a future built on strength, unity, and compassion. "I don't want to fail them," she whispered. "I don't want to fail you." Jackson gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Won't fail anyone. We'll figure this out together. We'll lead together. For a long moment, they sat there, lost in thought. Lyra's shoulders seemed to relax, as if a small part of the burden had been lifted. She still wasn't sure what the future held, but she was beginning to accept that she didn't have to face it alone. Later that evening, they gathered their council of advisors, including General Harris, the few remaining loyalists to the Thalorian, royal family, and representatives from various factions. The tension in the room was palpable, and Jackson could see that the Thalorian leaders were still unsure about the alliance with humanity. "We have a choice to make," Lyra began, her voice strong despite the doubts that still lingered in her mind. "The Zephyrians are threatening everything we've fought for. They want to divide us. They want to see the human-Thalorian alliance fail. We can't let that happen." A murmur of agreement went through the room, but not everyone was convinced. One of the older Thalorian leaders stood up, his voice full of doubt. "You ask us to trust humans," he said, his tone skeptical. "After everything they've done, how can we be sure that they will not turn against us?" Jackson stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're not asking for blind trust. We're asking for a chance. We fought beside each other in the war, and we've seen what we can accomplish when we work together. The Zephyrians want to break that bond. We can't let them." Lyra nodded, adding, "This is our chance to rebuild. It's not just the Thalorian Empire, but the entire galaxy. We have the opportunity to create something better, something that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past." The room was quiet as everyone considered Lyra's words. There was still fear, still uncertainty. But as Jackson looked around the room, he saw the first signs of hope. Maybe they could make this work. Maybe they could prove to the galaxy that they were stronger together than apart. "I will lead," Lyra said, her voice filled with determination. "But I will not lead alone. We will rebuild the Thalorian Empire, not as it was, but as it should have been." Jackson smiled at her, proud of the strength she had found within herself. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were ready to face the challenges ahead. The days following the meeting with the Thalorian Council were filled with urgency. Jackson and Lyra's decision to lead together had been a turning point, but the challenges were only beginning. The Zephyrian threat loomed large, and every day felt like they were racing against time. The galaxy was watching, waiting to see if the humans and Thalorians could truly unite, or if their fragile alliance would shatter under the pressure. Lyra had grown stronger in her role as leader, but the weight of her responsibility still weighed heavily on her. Jackson saw the strain in her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed whenever a new report came in from the Thalorian colonies. She had never wanted to be a ruler, but now that the war was over, she had no choice but to embrace her destiny. One morning, as they sat together in the war room, the door slid open, and General Harris entered, his face tense. "We've received new intelligence," he said, his voice low. "The Zephyrians have begun amassing forces at the edge of the Vither system. It looks like they're preparing for another assault. They've been rallying support from the outer colonies, stirring up fear about our alliance." Lyra's gaze hardened as she looked at the map on the table. The Vither system was strategically important, and if the Zephyrians attacked again, it would be a blow to their already fragile position. They couldn't afford another conflict, not when they were still rebuilding. "We need to act fast," Jackson said, his voice steady. "If the Zephyrians gain too much ground, they'll be able to rally more factions to their cause. We have to show the galaxy that we're strong and united." Lyra nodded, her fingers tapping lightly on the table as she thought. "But we don't have a full fleet. We don't have the resources to fight another war. How can we stop them if we don't have the strength to defend ourselves?" Jackson stood up, walking to the map. "We don't need to defeat them with brute force. We need to defeat them with strategy. If we can show the galaxy that our alliance is unbreakable, that we're standing together, the Zephyrians won't have the support they need." Lyra's eyes softened as she looked at him. "You're right. We've already started to gain the trust of some factions, but we need more. We need to prove that we can work together, not just fight together." "We've made progress," Jackson said, his tone reassuring. "No, we need to take the next step. We need to unite the galaxy, not just the Thalorians. If we can get the outer colonies on our side, we'll have the strength to face the Zephyrians." The room fell into a thoughtful silence. They were facing a difficult road ahead, but Jackson knew that they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The stakes were higher than ever, and the future of the galaxy depended on their ability to unite the people. After a moment, Lyra spoke again, her voice firm with resolve. "We'll send envoys to the outer colonies. We'll prove to them that we're stronger together than we are apart. If the Zephyrians want war, we'll show them that we're ready. We'll do it on our terms." The next few days were filled with preparations. Jackson and Lyra worked tirelessly, sending messages to the colonies, gathering information, and building alliances. They knew that the Zephyrians were watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. But Jackson and Lyra had one thing the Zephyrians didn't: hope, and they were determined to make sure that hope would be their greatest weapon. One evening, as they reviewed the final details of their strategy, General Harris entered with more news. "The envoys have returned from the outer colonies," he said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "The response has been ... encouraging. Several colonies have agreed to support us. They're willing to fight alongside us if the Zephyrians attack." Lyra's eyes lit up, and for the first time in days, a smile tugged at her lips. "A good start, but we still need more. We need to show them that our alliance is strong, that we can stand together and face the Zephyrians head-on." Jackson nodded. "We'll get more support. Once the word spreads, more factions will join. They'll see that this is their chance to secure a future, not just for the Thalorians, but for the entire galaxy." The weeks that followed were filled with meetings, negotiations, and careful planning. The alliances that Jackson and Lyra had forged began to grow stronger, and slowly, more and more colonies pledged their support. The Zephyrians continued to stir up fear, but Jackson and Lyra knew that the more united they became, the harder it would be for the Zephyrians to break them apart. Finally, the day came when the fleet was ready. The ships were prepared, the alliances were secured, and the galaxy stood at the brink of a new era. Jackson and Lyra stood together on the bridge of their flagship, looking out at the vastness of space. It was a moment of triumph, but there was no time to rest. The Zephyrians were still out there, and they were preparing for their next move. Lyra turned to Jackson, her eyes filled with determination. "This is it. We've come so far. We've united the galaxy, and now it's time to show the Zephyrians that we won't back down." Jackson nodded, his expression just as determined. "We've faced worse before, and we'll face this together." As the fleet moved into position, the stars outside the window seemed to shine brighter, as if the galaxy itself was waiting for what would come next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jackson and Lyra felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The Zephyrians may have underestimated them, but Jackson and Lyra were about to prove just how strong their alliance really was. Together, they would face the future, not as enemies, but as allies, united in their determination to rebuild the galaxy and make it stronger than ever.